Chapter 2 Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End. The Secretary General of the United Nations stood motionless by the great window, staring down at the crawling traffic on 43rd Street. He sometimes wondered if it was a good thing for any man to work at such an altitude above his fellow humans. Detachment was all very well, but it could change so easily to indifference. Or was he merely trying to rationalize his dislike of skyscrapers, still unabated after 20 years in New York? He heard the door open behind him, but did not turn to hear Peter von Ryberg come into the room. There was an inevitable pause as Peter looked disapprovingly at their thermostat, for it was a standing joke that the Secretary General loved living in an icebox. Stormgren waited until his assistant joined him at the window, then tore his gaze away from the familiar yet always fascinating panorama below. "They're late," he said. "Wainwright should have been here 5 minutes ago." "I've just heard from the police. He's got quite a procession with him, and it's snarled up the traffic. He should be here any moment now." Van Ryberg paused and added abruptly, "Are you still sure it's a good idea to see him? I'm afraid it's a little late to back out of it now. After all, I've agreed, though as you know, it was never my idea in the first place." Stormgren had walked to his desk and was fidgeting with his famous uranium paperweight. He was not nervous, merely undecided. He was also glad that Wainwright was late, for this would give him a slight moral advantage when the interview opened. Such trivialities played greater part in human affairs than anyone who set much store on logic and reason might wish. "Here they are," said Van Ryberg, suddenly pressing his face against the window. "They're coming along the avenue. A good 3,000, I'd say." Stormgren picked up his notebook and rejoined his assistant. Half a mile away, a small but determined crowd was moving slowly toward the Secretariat building and carried banners that were indecipherable at this distance, but Stormgren knew their message well enough. Presently, he would hear rising above the sound of traffic the ominous rhythm of chanting voices. He felt a sudden wave of disgust sweep over him. Surely the world had had enough of the marching mobs and angry slogans. The crowd had now come abreast of the building. It must know that it was watching, for here their fists were being shaken rather self-consciously in the air. They are not defying him, although the gesture was doubtless meant for Stormgren to see, as pygmies might threaten a giant. So those angry fists were directed up against the sky 50 kilometers above his head, against the gleaming silver cloud that was the flagship of the Overlord fleet. And very probably, thought Stormgren, Karelin was watching the whole thing and enjoying himself hugely, for this meeting would never have taken place at the supervisor's instigation. This was the first time that Stormgren had ever met the head of the Freedom League. He had ceased to wonder if action was wise, for Karelin's plans were often so subtle for merely human understanding. At the worst, Stormgren did not see that any position harm could be done. If he had refused to see Wainwright, the League would have used the fact that ammunition against him. Alexander Wainwright was a tall, handsome man in his late 40s. He was, Stormgren knew, completely honest and therefore doubly dangerous. Stormgren knew completely, yet his obvious sincerity made it hard to dislike him. Whatever views one might have on the cause for which he stood, about some of his followers he had attracted. Stormgren wasted no time after Van Ryberg's brief and somewhat strained introductions. "I suppose," he began, "the chief object of your visit is to register a formal protest against the Federation scheme. Am I correct?" Wainwright nodded gravely. "This is my main purpose, Mr. Secretary. As you know, for the last 5 years we have tried to awaken the human race to the danger that confronts it. The task has been a difficult one, for the majority of the people seem content to let the overlords run the world as they please. Nevertheless, more than 5 million patriots in every country have signed our petition." "That's not a very impressive figure out of the 2.5 billion. It is a figure that cannot be ignored, and for every person who has signed, there are many who feel grave doubts about the wisdom, not to mention the rightness of the Federation plan. Even the superior Karelin, for all his powers, cannot wipe out 1,000 years of history at a stroke of a pen." "What does anyone know of Karelin's powers?" retorted Stormgren. "When I was a boy, the Federation of Europe was a dream. But when I grew to manhood, it became a reality, and that was before the arrival of the Overlords. Karelin is merely finishing the work we had begun. Europe was a cultural and geographic entity, and the world is not. That is the difference. To the Overlords, replied Stormgren sarcastically, the Earth probably is a great deal smaller than Europe seemed to our fathers, and their outlook, I submit, is more mature than ours. I do not necessarily quarrel with Federation as an ultimate objective, though many of my supporters might not agree, but it must come from within, not superimposed from without. We must work out our destiny. There must be no interference in human affairs. Stormgren sighed. All this he had heard 100 times before, and he knew that he could only give the old answer that the Freedom League had refused to accept. He had faith in Karelin, and they had not. That was the fundamental difference, and there was nothing he could do about it. Luckily, there was nothing the Federation Freedom League could do about it either. Let me ask you a few questions, he said. Can you deny the Overlords have brought security, peace, and prosperity to the world? This is true, but they have taken our liberty. Man does not live, yes, by bread alone, yes, I know, but this is the first age in which every man was sure of getting even that. In any case, what freedom have we lost compared to what's that the Overlords have given us for the first time in human history? Freedom to control our own lives under God's guidance. At last, Stormgren, we've got to the point. Basically, the conflict was a religious one. However much it must be disguised. Wainwright never let you forget that he was a clergyman. Though he was no longer wore a clerical collar, somehow one always got the impression it was still there. Last month, pointed out Stormgren, 100 bishops, cardinals, and rabbis signed a joint declaration pledging their support for the supervisor's policy. The world's religions are against you. Wainwright shook his head in angry denial. Many of the leaders are blind. They have been corrupted by the Overlords. When they realize the danger, it must be too late. Humanity will have lost the initiative and become a subject race. There was silence for a moment, then Stormgren replied, In 3 days, I will be meeting with the supervisor again. I will explain your objections to him, since it is my duty to represent the views of the world, but it will alter nothing, I can assure you of that. There was one other point, said Wainwright slowly. We have many objections to the Overlords, but above all, we detest their secretiveness. You are the only human being who has ever spoken with Karelin, and even you have not seen him. It is surprising that we doubt his motives, despite all that he has done for humanity. Yes, despite that, I do not know which we resent more, Karelin's omnipotence or his secrecy. If he has nothing to hide, why will he never reveal himself? Next time you speak with the supervisor, Mr. Stormgren, ask him that. Stormgren was silent. There was nothing he could say to this, nothing at any rate that would convince the other. Sometimes he wondered if he had really convinced himself. It was, of course, only a very small operation from their point of view, but to the Earth it was the biggest thing that had ever happened. There had been no warning when the great ships came pouring out of the unknown depths of space. Countless times this day had been described in fiction, but no one really believed that it would ever come. Now it had dawned at last. The gleaming silent shapes hanging over every land were the symbol of a science that man could not hope to match for centuries. For 6 days they had floated motionless above the cities, giving no hint that they knew of his existence, but none was needed. Not by the chance alone could those mighty ships have come to rest so precisely over New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Rome, Cape Town, Tokyo, Canberra. Even before the ending of those heart-freezing days, some men had guessed the truth. This was not their first tentative contact by a race which knew nothing of man. Within those silent, unmoving ships, master psychologists were studying humanity's reaction. When the curve of tension had reached its peak, they would act. And on the 6th day, Karelin, supervisor for the Earth, made himself known to the world in a broadcast that blanketed every radio frequency. He spoke in English, so perfect that the controversy it began was to rage across the Atlantic for a generation. But the context of this speech was more staggering even than its delivery. By any standards, it was a work of superlative genius, showing a complete and absolute mastery of human affairs. There could be no doubt that its scholarship and virtuosity its tantalizing glimpse of knowledge still untapped, were deliberately designed to convince mankind that it was a presence of overwhelming intellect power. When Corellan had finished, the nations of Earth knew that their days of precarious sovereignty had ended. Local internal governments would still retain their powers, but in wider field of international affairs, the supreme decision had passed from human hands. Argument, protest, all were futile. It had hardly to be expected that all the nations of Earth would submit tamely to such limitation of their powers. Yet active resistance presented baffling difficulties. For the destruction of the Overlords ships, even it could not be achieved when annihilate the cities beneath them. Nevertheless, one major power had made the attempt. Perhaps those responsible hoped to kill two birds with one atomic missile, for their target was floating above the capital of an adjoining and unfriendly nation. As the great ship's image had expanded on the television screen in the secret control room, a little group of officers and technicians must have been torn by many emotions. If they succeeded, what action would the remaining ships take? Could they also be destroyed, leaving humanity to govern its ways once more? Or would Corellan wreak some frightful vengeance upon those who had attacked him? The screen became suddenly blank as the missile destroyed itself on impact, and the picture switched immediately to an airborne camera many miles away. In a fraction of a second that had elapsed, the fireball should have already formed and should be filling the sky with a solar flame. Yet nothing whatsoever had happened. The great ship floated unharmed, bathed in the raw sunlight of the edge of space. Not only had the bomb failed to touch it, but none could have ever decided what happened to the missile. Moreover, Corellan took no action against those responsible, nor even indicated that he had known of the attack. He ignored them contemptuously, leaving them to worry over the vengeance that never came. It was a more effective and more demoralizing treatment than any punitive action could have ever been. The government responsible collapsed in mutual recrimination a few weeks later. There had also been more passive resistance to the policy of the Overlords. Usually Corellan had been able to deal with it by letting those concerned have their own way, until they had discovered that they were only hurting themselves by the refusing to cooperate. Only once had he taken direct action against a recalcitrant government. For more than 100 years, the Republic of South Africa had been the center of racial strife. Men of goodwill on both sides tried to build a bridge, but in vain. Fears or prejudice were too deeply ingrained to permit any cooperation. Successive governments had differed only in the degree of their intolerance. The land was poisoned with the hate and aftermath of civil war. When it became clear that no attempt could be made to end the discrimination, Corellan gave his warning. It merely named a date, time, no more. There was apprehension, but little fear or panic, for no one believed that the Overlords would take any violent, destructive action which would involve innocents and guilty alike. Nor did they. All that happened was the sun passed the meridian at Cape Town. It went out. There remained visible merely a pale, purple ghost, giving no heat or light. Somehow out in space, the light of the sun had been polarized by two crossing fields, so that no radiation could pass. The effect was 500 kilometers across and perfectly circular. The demonstration lasted 30 minutes. It was sufficient. The next day, the government of South Africa announced that the full rights would be restored to the white minority. Apart from such isolated incidents, the human race had accepted the Overlords as part of the natural order of things. In a surprisingly short time, the initial shock had worn off, and the world went about its business again. The greatest change suddenly awakened Rip Van Winkle would have noticed a hushed expectancy, a mental glance over the shoulder as mankind waited for the Overlords to show themselves and to step down from their gleaming ships. 5 years later, it was still waiting. That, thought Stormgren, was cause of all the trouble. There was the usual circle of sightseers, cameras, and ready as Stormgren's car drove to the landing field. The Secretary General had exchanged a few final words with his assistant, collected his briefcase, and walked through the ring of spectators. Corellan never kept him waiting for long. There was a sudden "oh" from the crowd as a silver bubble expanded with a breathtaking speed in the sky above. A gust of air tore at Stormgren's clothes as the tiny ship came to rest 50 meters away, floating delicately a few centimeters above the ground, as if it feared contamination with the earth. As he walked slowly forward, Stormgren saw that the familiar puckering of the seamless metallic hull, and in the moment of opening there had been no baffled in the world's best scientist appeared before him. He stepped through it into the ship's single, softly lit room. The entrance sealed itself as if it had never been there, shutting out all sound and light. It opened again 5 minutes later. There had been no sensation of movement, but Stormgren knew that he was now 50 kilometers above the earth, deep in the heart of Corellian's ship. He was in the world of the Overlords. All around him, they were going about their mysterious business. He had come nearer to them than any other man, yet he knew no more of their physical nature than any of the millions of the world below. The little conference room was at the end of a short, connecting corridor that was unfurnished apart from a single chair and the table beneath the vision screen. As was intended, it told absolutely nothing of the creatures who had built it. Their vision screen was empty now, as it had always been. Sometimes in his dreams, Stormgren had imagined that it had suddenly flashed into life, revealing the secret that tormented all the world. But the dream had never come true. Behind that rectangle of darkness lay utter mystery. Yet also lay power and wisdom, and perhaps most of all, an immense, humorous affection of the little creatures crawling all along the planet below. From the hidden grill came the calm, never-hurried voice that Stormgren knew so well, that the world had heard it only once in history. Its depths and resonance gave a single clue that existed to Corellian's physical nature, for it left an overwhelming impression of the sheer size. Corellian was large, perhaps much larger than a man. It was true that some scientist, after analyzing the record of his only speech, had suggested the voice was that of a machine. This was something that Stormgren could never believe. "Yes, Ricky, I was listening to your little interview. What did you make of Mr. Wainwright?" "He's an honest man, even if many of his supporters aren't. What are we going to do about him? The League itself isn't dangerous, but some of its extremists are openly advocating violence. I've been wondering if I should put a guard on my house, but I hope it isn't necessary." Corellian avoided the point in an annoying way he sometimes had. The details of the World Federation had been out for a month now. There had been a substantial increase in 7% who don't approve of me, or the 12% who don't know. Not yet, but that's of no importance. What does worry me is general feeling, even among your supporters, that it had time for this secrecy to come to an end. Corellian's sigh was technically perfect, yet somehow lacked conviction. "That's your feeling too, isn't it?" The question was so rhetorical that Stormgren did not bother to answer it. "I've wondered if you really appreciate," he continued earnestly, "how difficult the state of affairs makes my job." "It doesn't exactly help mine," replied Corellian with some spirit. "I wish people would stop thinking me as a dictator, and remember, I'm only a civil servant trying to administer a colonial policy in whose shaping I had no hand." That, thought Stormgren, was quite an engaging description. He wondered just how much truth it held. "Can you at least give me some reason for your concealment? Because we don't understand it. It annoys us. It gives us rise to endless rumors." Corellian gave that rich, deep laugh of his, just too resonant to be altogether human. "What am I supposed to be now? Does the robot theory still hold the field? I'd rather be a mass of electron tubes than a thing like a centipede." "Oh yes, I've seen the cartoon yesterday's Chicago Tribune. I'm thinking of requesting the original." Stormgren pursed his lips primly. There was times he thought Corellian took his duties too lightly. "This is serious," he said reprovingly. "My dear Ricky," Corellian retorted, "it's only by not taking the human race seriously that I have retained what fragments of my once considerable mental powers I still possess." Despite himself, Stormgren smiled. "That doesn't help me a great deal, does it? I have to go down there and convince my fellow man that although you won't show yourself, you've got nothing to hide. It's not an easy job. Curiosity is the most dominant of human characteristics. Can you defy it forever?" "Of all the problems that faced us when we came to Earth, this was the most difficult," admitted Karelin. You have trusted our wisdom in any other matters. Surely you can trust us in this. I trust you, said Stormgren, but Wainwright does not, nor do his supporters. Can you really blame them if they had put a bad interpretation on your unwillingness to show yourself? There was silence for a moment, then Stormgren heard a faint sound. Was it cackling? That might have been caused by the supervisor moving his body slightly. You know why Wainwright and his kind fear me, don't you? Asked Karelin. His voice was somber now, like a great organ rolling the notes from a high cathedral nave. You will find men like him in all the world's religions. They know that we represent reason and science, and however confident they may be in their beliefs, they fear that we will overthrow their gods. Not necessarily through any deliberate act, but in a subtler fashion. Science can destroy religion by ignoring it, as well as by disproving its tenets. No one ever demonstrated, so far as I'm aware, the non-existence of Zeus or Thor, but they have few followers now. The Wainwright fear, too, that we know the truth about the origins of their faiths, how long they wonder. Have we been observing humanity? Have we watched Muhammad begin his Hijrah, or Moses giving the Jews their laws? Do we know all the false in their stories they believe? And do you? Whispered Stormgren half to himself. That, Ricky, is the fear that torments them, even though they will never admit it openly. Believe me, it gives me no pleasure in destroying men's faiths. But all the world's religions cannot be right. They know it. Sooner or later, men's has to learn the truth. But by that time is not yet. As for secrecy, which you are correct in saying aggravates our problems, that is a matter beyond my control. I regret the need for this concealment as much as you do, but the reasons are sufficient. However, I will try to get a statement from my superiors, which may satisfy you and perhaps placate the Freedom League. Now, please, can we return to the agenda and start recording again? Well, asked Van Ryberg anxiously, did you have any luck? I don't know, Stormgren replied wearily as he threw the files down on the desk and collapsed into the seat. Karelin's consulting his superiors now, whoever or whatever that might be. He won't make any promises. Listen, said Piter abruptly. I've just thought of something. What reason have we for believing that there is anything beyond Karelin? Suppose all the Overlords, as we christen them, are right here on Earth in these ships theirs. They might be nowhere else to go and hiding the fact from us. It's an ingenious theory, grinned Stormgren, but it classes what little we know or think we know about Karelin's background. And how much is that? Well, he often refers to his position there as something temporary, hindering him from getting on with his real work. I think it's some form of mathematics. Once I quoted Axe's comment about the power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely. I wanted to see how he'd react to that. He gave a cavernous laugh of his and said, There's no danger of that happening to me. In the fairest case, the sooner I finish my work here, the sooner I can go back to where I belong. A good many light years from here. And secondly, I don't have absolute power by any means. I'm just supervisor. Of course, he had been misleading me. I can never be sure of that. He's immortal, isn't he? Yes, by our standards, though there's something in the future he seems to fear. I can't imagine what it is, and that's really all I know about him. It isn't very conclusive. My theory is that his little fleet lost in space and is looking for a new home. He doesn't want us to know how few he is and his comrades are. Perhaps the other ships are automatic and there's no one in them. They're just imposing facade. You, says Stormgren, have been reading too much science fiction. Van Ryberg grinned a little sheepishly. The invasion from space didn't turn out quite as expected, didn't. My theory would certainly explain why Karelin never shows himself. He doesn't want us to learn that there aren't any more Overlords. Stormgren shook his head in an amused disagreement. Your explanation, as usual, is much too ingenious to be true, though we can only infer its existence. There must be a great civilization behind the supervisor, and one that has known about man for a very long time. Karelin himself must have been studying us for centuries. Look at this command of English, for example. He taught me how to speak it idiomatically. Have you ever discovered anything he doesn't know? Oh, yes, quite often. Only on trivial points. I think he has an absolute perfect memory, but there are some things he hasn't bothered to learn. For instance, English is the only language he understands completely, though in 2 years he picked up a good deal of Finnish just to tease me. And one doesn't learn Finnish in a hurry. He can quote great slabs of the Klavela, which I'm ashamed to say I know only a few lines. He also knows the biographics of all living statesmen, and sometimes I can identify the reference he's used. His knowledge of history and science seems complete. You know how much we've already learned from him, taken one at a time? I don't think his mental gifts are quite outside the range of human achievement, but no one man could possibly do all the things he does. That's more or less what I've decided already, agreed Van Ryberg. We can argue around Karelin forever, but in the end, it'll always come back to the same question. Why the devil won't he show himself? Until he does, I'll go on theorizing about the Freedom League, and we'll go on fomenting. He cocked a rebellious eye at the ceiling. One dark night, Mr. Supervisor. I hope some reporter takes a rocket up to your ship and climbs through that back door with a camera. What a scoop that would be. If Karelin was listening, he gave no sign. But of course, he never did. In the first year of the coming, the advent of the Overlords had made less difference in the pattern of human life than might have been expected. The shadows was everywhere, but it was an unobtrusive shadow. There were few great cities on Earth where men could not see one of their silver ships glittering against the zenith. After a little while, they are taken much granted as the sun, moon, or clouds. Most men were probably only dimly aware that their steadily rising standards of living were due to the Overlords. When they stopped to think about it, which was seldom, they realized that those silent ships had brought peace to the world for the first time in history and were dully grateful. But these were negative and unspectacular benefits, accepted and soon forgotten. The Overlords remained aloof, hiding their faces from mankind. Karelin could command respect and admiration. He could win nothing deeper as long as he pursued his present policy. It was hard not to feel any resentment against these Olympians who spoke to man only over radio teleprinter circuits at the United Nations headquarters. What took place between Karelin and Stormgren was never publicly revealed, and sometimes Stormgren himself wondered why the supervisor found these interviews necessary. Perhaps he felt the need of direct contact with one human being, at least. Perhaps he realized that Stormgren needed this form of personal support. If this was the explanation, Secretary General appreciated it, but did not mind the Freedom Leagues referred to him contemptuously as Karelin's office boy. The Overlords had never had any dealings with individual states or governments. They had taken the United Nations organization, as they found it, had given instructions for installing the necessary radio equipment, had issued their orders through the mouth of the Secretary General. Soviet delegate had quite correctly pointed out at considerable length and upon innumerable occasions that this was not only not in accordance with the charter. Karelin didn't seem to worry. It was amazing that so many abuses, follies, and evils could be dispelled by those messages from the sky. With the arrival of the Overlords, nations knew they need no longer fear each other, and they guessed, even before the experiment was made, that their existing weapons were certainly impotent against a civilization that could bridge the stars. So, at once, the greatest single obstacle to the happiness of mankind had been removed. The Overlords seemed largely indifferent to forms of government, provided they were not oppressive or corrupt. Earth still possessed democracies, monarchies, benevolent dictatorships, communisms, and capitalism. This was a source of great surprise to many simple souls who were quite convinced that theirs was the only way possible of life. Others believed that Karelin was merely waiting to introduce a system which would sweep away all existing forms of society, and so had not bothered with minor political reforms. But this, like other speculations concerning the Overlords, was pure guesswork. No one knew their motives, and no one knew towards what future they were shepherding mankind.